How could a nation of villagers, with no more than 8,000 men, stand against the thunder of 20,000 imperial soldiers? How could fragile wooden boats dare to challenge towering warships, bristling with armor and steel? How could farmers and fishermen, armed with little more than courage, confront an empire that stretched its shadow across the seas? And yet, on one river, on one fateful day, the impossible became real. They came like thunder from the north, not as neighbors, but as conquerors. The Southern Han looked at the rich delta and saw tribute, taxes, prestige. For their emperor, Vietnam was a prize to be claimed, a proof of imperial might. This was not a border skirmish. It was an attempt to crush a people and fold their land into an empire. That certainty, the certainty that another people could be taken as property, is what kindled a bitter, burning rage in the hearts of the Vietnamese. This was the reason they fought. Not only for land, but for dignity, for the right to govern their own fate. The math was brutal and simple. Contemporary estimates place the Southern Han invasion force at roughly 20,000 men carried in a large fleet of war junks. Heavily manned ships, each carrying dozens of warriors. Against them, Ngo Quyen marshaled a force far smaller. Historians commonly estimate somewhere between 5,000 and 10,000 local fighters, a mixture of rivermen, militia, and hastily rallied levies. The difference was not marginal. It was the weight of empire versus the ragged bravery of a local people. Numbers tell only part of the story. The Southern Han had advantages that mattered on open water and on the plain: armored decks, trained crews, organized command, and the logistics to feed and transport thousands. Their ships were built for dominance. Long, broad-hulled junks that carried not only men, but the confidence of an empire. But that very confidence was its weakness. They were trained for maneuvering in large formations on open seas, not for the treacherous estuaries and tidal labyrinths of the Bach Dang. In those narrow channels, size became a liability, discipline became rigid, surprise became unlikely. Ngo Quyen's side had neither numbers nor thunder. Their strengths were different and quieter. Intimate knowledge of tides and mud, crews who read the river like a book, and an iron will forged in generations of resisting foreign control. He led smaller, shallower boats and men who could slip between mangrove roots and shoals. Men who understood how the sea rose and fell with deadly regularity. He had boldness, local intelligence, and the willingness to make the river itself his weapon. Yet his weaknesses were stark. Manpower was limited. His fighters were not imperial veterans with decades of drill. Many were farmers and fishermen armed and trained for survival, not pitched battles. The odds were stacked. The courage had to make up the difference. So why fight? Because the Southern Han's campaign would mean loss of more than bread. It would mean forced tribute, garrisons on Vietnamese soil, cultural erasure, the slow suffocation of a people's right to live by their own laws. That injustice sharpened resolve into action. The Southern Han's arrogance, believing a few thousand men and some warships could snuff out the will of a people, became the very blade that cut their fate. On the Bach Dang, the question was plain. Would sheer imperial force crush the seed of nationhood, or would cunning and a people's fury turn tide into weapon? In the hush before battle, two facts sat like thunderheads: an invading host of about 20,000 men with powerful ships, and a defending force perhaps a quarter of that size, armed with intimate river knowledge and desperate resolve. The stage was set for a mismatch, and for a legend to be born. Ngo Quyen knew that courage alone could not stop the Southern Han. Bravery without strategy was a flame that burned bright and died quickly. Against 20,000 men and a fleet of warships, he needed more than valor. He needed the river itself. So he studied the tides. The Bach Dang was no ordinary river. It was a living thing, breathing with the sea. Twice a day the tide rose high, swallowing its banks, making the channel wide and deep. Twice a day the tide fell, bearing sandbars and sucking ships into mud. To the untrained eye, it was a nuisance. To Ngo Qian, it was destiny. His plan was daring, almost unthinkable. Along a stretch of the river where the tide fell fastest, he ordered thousands of sharpened wooden stakes to be driven deep into the riverbed. Each stake was thick as a man's arm, tipped with iron, its point angled upstream. When the water rose, the forest of death vanished beneath the surface, invisible to anyone sailing through. But when the tide fell, the traps would emerge like fangs from a monster's jaw. It was exhausting work. Farmers became laborers, fishermen became engineers, soldiers became carpenters. Night after night, by torchlight, men waded waist-deep in water, hammering stakes into the mud. They sweated, they bled, but they built a weapon unlike any other. Beneath the calm waters of Bach Dang, an ambush was waiting, silent, patient, merciless. Ngo Qian's army, though small, had discipline of a different kind. Not drilled formations, not imperial armor, but unity, trust, and knowledge of the land. He instructed his men, when the southern Han advanced, they would draw them deep into the river, feign retreat, and let the invaders chase. Then at the precise moment when the tide began to ebb, the trap would be sprung. It was a gamble. His forces numbered perhaps 7,000 or 8,000 against an enemy nearly triple their size. His ships were lighter, his men less trained in conventional warfare. A single mistake, a premature retreat, a misjudged tide, and everything would collapse. But Ngo Qian believed in two things with absolute certainty: the rhythm of the river and the spirit of his people. And so, the stage was set. The river held its secret. The Kogo, the stakes, waited beneath the waves like an army of ghosts. Above, the sky darkened, as if the heavens themselves held their breath. The invaders were coming, confident and blind. Ngo Qian was ready. The day finally came. The southern Han fleet appeared on the horizon, sails rising like a forest of white, drums echoing across the waters. Their admiral, Liu Hongkao, the emperor's own son, stood tall on the deck of his flagship. Behind him stretched row upon row of war junks, bristling with spears, archers, and armored marines. Nearly 20,000 men filled those decks, their banners snapping proudly in the wind. To them, it was a parade, not a battle. They had every reason to feel invincible. Their numbers dwarfed the defenders. Their armor gleamed under the sun. Their ships were massive, and their supplies seemed endless. To crush a few thousand rebels in wooden boats, surely it would be swift, glorious, and inevitable. But as the fleet pressed deeper into the Bach Dang, the waters changed. The river narrowed, the channels twisted, and the tide, high and rising, carried them swiftly inland. The southern Han Marines cheered, confident the enemy had no place to run. Then they saw them. Ngo Qian's ships, smaller, lighter, fewer in number, hovering on the river like insects before giants. Drums beat from the shore, horns sounded, and the Vietnamese boats moved as if to meet the enemy. For a moment, the southern Han laughed. This was the resistance? This handful of fragile craft? The clash was sudden. Arrows darkened the sky, spears thrust, ships collided. But just as quickly as it began, the Vietnamese boats broke away, turning downstream, retreating before the Imperial fleet. To the southern Han, it looked like panic. They roared with laughter, convinced victory was already theirs. "Press on," Liu Hongkao ordered. "Do not let them escape." And so the mighty fleet surged forward, chasing deeper and deeper into the winding river. The tide was still high, masking the danger below. Beneath the surface, hidden in silence, the sharpened stakes waited like teeth. From the riverbanks, villagers watched with pounding hearts. They knew what the enemy did not. Every oar stroke of the southern Han brought them closer to their doom. Ngo Qian, standing at the helm of his command boat, watched the tide, not the enemy. His eyes fixed on the water's slow retreat, waiting for the exact moment when the river would turn. The trap was closing, the invaders were inside, and the tide was about to betray them. The river answered like a living thing. At first it was subtle, the water pulling away, sighing. Then as the tide fell, the world changed. The smooth surface that had swallowed the hidden stakes for months split open. Ridges of pointed wood rose from the mud like the teeth of a monstrous jaw. War junks, proud and slow, found their bellies rent and their keels caught. A dozen great ships shuddered, ground to a halt. And then the screams began. Chaos blossomed at once. The Southern Han fleet, once an ordered column of banners and drums, became a trapped forest of timber and men. Decks tilted painfully. Soldiers, armored and bewildered, scrambled as the lists of their ships yawed and rolled. Some were flung into the cold water and vanished beneath the tide. Others hung from rigging, helpless and shouting prayers to gods that offered no answer. Ngo Quyen's plan did not rely on a single stroke. It was a symphony of brutal precision. As the stakes impaled the enemy's hulls, Vietnamese boats, sleek, shallow, and numerous, swarmed the immobilized junks. Archers let loose a storm of arrows from upriver and downriver positions, filling the air with the sound of whistling death. Spearmen leapt aboard with ropes and grapnels, clambering over railings as flames from torches and oil, flung by the defenders, caught on rigging and canvas. Fire spread with a hungry brightness, turning the river into a corridor of smoke and red reflection. Look at the battlefield. On the Nam Han side, armored Marines tried to form coherent defense lines on decks that had become islands. Their commanders, proud men who had expected easy victory, barked orders that drowned in the roar of panic. On the Vietnamese side, small crews moved like shadows, coordinated and merciless. From hidden embankments, militia let fly volleys. From concealed skiffs, close combat fighters swung sabers and thrust spears into the wounded and the trapped. The fighting was intimate, up close, and merciless. Wood against steel, oarlocks breaking under the crush of bodies, blood-slicking planks. At the center of this fury, the flagship of the Southern Han became a theater of desperate bravery. Liu Hongqiao, the admiral, fought with the arrogance of an imperial son, rallying men even as the water choked their lines. But the stakes had already done their work. His flagship listed, masts snapped, and the boat became a tomb and a battleground in one. Some accounts say he died fighting on the deck, a blaze around him. Others say he leapt into the river in a final attempt to escape and was swallowed by the tides. Either way, the loss of such a leader cracked the morale of the invaders like a struck drum. Ngo Quyen did not allow indulgence. He ordered flanking units to press the crippled junks, to sever any hope of regrouping. Boats would dart behind enemy sterns to cut off retreats. Men would wade into shallows where larger ships could not follow. He used the ebbing water not only to expose the stakes, but to funnel the enemy into kill zones, narrow reaches where every broadside would hit nothing but timber and flame. Where the Southern Han tried to regroup into small pockets of resistance, Vietnamese forces concentrated to crush those pockets with overwhelming focused ferocity. The battle moved in waves. One junk's fire would flare, then another would catch. Screams echoed over the sound of splintering wood. The sky filled with smoke and arrows. The water, once reflective, ran black and red. Throughout it all, the Vietnamese fighters showed a ferocity born of desperation and homeland. They were not fighting for conquest. They were fighting for family, field, and the right to wake under their own roof. That made them terrible opponents. When the last great junk finally burned and the remaining invaders fled or surrendered, the river lay scarred. Floating wreckage creaked and turned in eddies. Survivors clung to debris and prayed, while villagers and soldiers picked through the aftermath. The cost was high on both sides, but the strategic victory was absolute. A proud imperial armada had been broken, its officers dead or captured, its dream of domination undone. In that moment, Bach Dang ceased to be only a river. It became a crucible, the place where a people's fury, cunning, and mastery of their home reversed the fortunes of empire. When the battle ended, silence did not come. It was broken by the groan of shattered hulls, the hiss of dying fires, and the cries of men clinging to wreckage. The mighty fleet of the Southern Han, once a proud armada of banners and drums, was now a graveyard of splintered wood and drifting corpses. The river that had carried their arrogance now carried their ruin. Liu Hongkao, the emperor's son, lay among the dead. His body, whether claimed by fire or swallowed by the tide, never returned to the imperial court. With his fall, the backbone of the invasion shattered. The chain of command dissolved, officers were slain or captured, and the survivors broke into scattered fragments, leaderless and hunted. The victors pressed their advantage. Vietnamese boats moved through the wreckage, spears ready, capturing survivors who begged for mercy. Some were spared as prisoners, living proof of the empire's defeat. Others met the fate they had brought upon themselves, sinking beneath the waters they had once sought to dominate. On the riverbanks, villagers poured out, their eyes wide with disbelief. They had lived under the shadow of empire for generations, forced to bow, to pay tribute, to endure humiliation. Now they saw with their own eyes an empire's fleet, crushed by their own sons, their own brothers, their own king. Cheers rose into the air, mixing with the smoke of burning ships, a sound as fierce as any war drum. The strategic weight of the victory was enormous. The Southern hand had thrown 20,000 men into the campaign. Almost all were lost, killed, drowned, or captured. The empire had lost not only its fleet, but its will to continue the conquest. Never again would the Southern Han attempt to subdue Vietnam. What they thought a simple province had proven to be an iron wall. For Ngo Quyen, the triumph was more than military. It was a declaration. With this battle, he broke the chains of centuries. He showed his people that the great empires of the North were not invincible. That freedom was not a dream, but something that could be won, seized, and held, if only one dared to fight. As the sun set that day, the river glowed with embers and corpses. It was a terrible sight, yet it was also holy. The Bach Dang had become an altar, baptizing Vietnam's independence in fire and blood. The smoke lifted, but the memory did not fade. On that stretch of the Bach Dang, in the year 938, Ngo Quyen and his people carved their names into history. The victory was not just a battle won, it was a rebirth. For the first time in centuries, Vietnam was free from foreign domination. Ngo Quyen declared independence, establishing himself as king of a land no longer bound by imperial chains. The Southern Han, humiliated and broken, abandoned their designs on Vietnam. They would never again send their fleets down the Bach Dang. What they thought a province had proven to be a nation. The legacy of that day is greater than strategy, greater than courage. It is proof. Proof that a smaller force, guided by cunning and unity, can stand against overwhelming numbers. Proof that the river, the land, and the will of the people can become weapons more powerful than any empire's army. Generations would remember. Parents told their children of the battle where wooden stakes shattered warships, where fishermen and farmers fought like lions, where a nation was born from the tide. Centuries later, when new empires came, the Mongols, the Ming, the Qing, the French, the spirit of Bach Dang echoed in the hearts of those who resisted. Ngo Quyen became more than a king. He became the founder of Vietnam's independence, a symbol of defiance, the man who taught his people that no empire was eternal, that freedom could be seized by those bold enough to fight for it. His triumph stood as a promise across time. Rivers may rise and fall, empires may come and go, but the spirit of a free people endures. The Bach Dang River still flows today, quiet and calm, its waters reflecting the sky. But beneath its gentle surface lies memory, of stakes rising like fangs, of ships burning, of voices shouting in the smoke. The river remembers, and so does the nation. For in 938 on that river, Vietnam was not just defended, it was born.